Welcome to the Centre for Public Integrity's podcast series. The Centre is Australia's leading democracy research institute. In these podcasts, we aim to bring listeners with us as we explore with key decision makers and policy designers just how our democracy works. I'm Michael Barker, former Federal Court Judge and a Director at the Centre. Today, I'm pleased to welcome to the podcast Andrew Barr, Chief Minister of the ACT. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Most people probably know the ACT as Canberra, I suppose, the ACT, but it's a really interesting Chief Minister's job you've got for that territory, because there are some people who describe Canberra as a very large capital city, of which you're the Lord Mayor of, with municipal as well as state-like function, as well as a territory of Australia, of which you're the Chief Minister. And that's made very clear by the COVID period when you were a member of the national cabinet in that time. Am I correct in recalling that?
Yeah. So look, it is a unique role in Australian politics. There's, in its wisdom, the Australian Parliament, when it granted self-government to the ACT, set up effectively a hybrid of state and local government. I think it made sense given Canberra's population at that time and still makes sense today. So the ACT government has responsibility for all of the municipal services that people of the rest of Australia would know would be delivered by their local council, as well as the state-type functions of running a health system, an education system, a legal system, and the like. So it presents, I would say, on balance, many advantages in the coordination of government policy and programs, but does have some drawbacks in so much as health expenditure, for example, accounts for around a third of the total territory budget and growing. And so that does place pressure on other areas of government responsibility, which local councils wouldn't experience to the same extent.
Andrew, 40 years ago, the first half of the 1980s, when you were much younger than you are today, you were still very young, everybody in Canberra, when I was teaching ANU Law School, was wanting something like self-government. There's a constant bleating about it. People wonder if it would never happen. Is it considered not qualified good for the territory?
I think it would depend on who you ask and what their sort of experience and longevity in the city. There'd still be a section of the community who longed for the days of very, very high levels of Commonwealth government subsidy and effectively the rest of Australia paying for Canberra's development. I think that era was always going to come to an end at some point. And when the decision was made, that very first election did see about a quarter of the parliament elected on a platform of abolishing self-government or being opposed to self-government. But that lasted one parliamentary term. And since then, really now more than 30 years, we've had remarkable political stability, even in an electoral system that is proportional representation, multi-district sees members from different political parties and independents elected. It's a system largely drawn from the Tasmanian head-clerk system with some slight local tweaks to suit the ACT political environment.
And you're lucky probably not to have an upper house like every Australian state has, except for Queensland.
Yes, I think the intent of the formation of self-government was that the lower house, the Legislative Assembly, would be elected by proportional representation, so there wasn't a need to effectively have a duplicate chamber elected in the same format. So, I guess Tasmania probably is the exception there, and as I understand, their lower house is head-clerk PR, but their upper house is single-member electorates, which is unusual in the Australian context. But initially, the ACT elected its assembly at large. So there was one electorate territory-wide. That did lead in the early days to perhaps a sense that there weren't local members for particular parts of the territory. So a decision was taken sort of about 10 years into self-government to move to a model of electorates. We initially had 3. We now have 5. Those 5 electorates return 5 members to the Assembly. And so in order to govern, the Chief Minister, at the very first sitting of the Assembly after an election, there's a vote for who the Chief Minister will be, and you need to secure a majority of elected members to be elected Chief Minister, which is a different model to the Australian states and the Northern Territory, who require a governor to make a decision. And this is very topical this week because the Tasmanian Parliament has produced the Tasmanian electorate has produced a hung parliament, and the governor has made, an initial call to reappoint a premier who will then have to face the floor of the Tasmanian Parliament when it first sits. That model is effectively how the ACT operates, that after an election, there is a single day of sitting, and that sitting elects the Speaker of the Parliament and the Chief Minister.
Well, I'm taking it from what you said that you're and fellow Assembly members in Canberra are perfectly happy with that system. And as you say, the current sort of imbroglio, or however one wants to describe it, in Tasmania will be worked out by everybody sitting in the chamber deciding which side they're going to line up on.
Indeed, yes. And I think we bypass a lot of that debate and controversy by just having a straight vote on the floor. So at any point, obviously, if you are in minority, you run the risk of no longer having the confidence of the Assembly. But what we have done, and this has been a model over a number of different territory parliaments, is to strike supply and confidence agreements that are sometimes quite detailed, but are written down and publicly available, and require a degree of accountability then for all of the co-signed parties.
Well, it's interesting with your districts, and 5 from each, and they've all got wonderful names. Am I right in thinking yours is something like Currajong?
That is right, yes. And so some reflect place names or rivers or mountain ranges, but that sort of reflect the different geography of different parts of the ACT.
In the course of this podcast, we could come to this question at any time, really, but you've had elections relatively recently. You've been returned and again selected as the Chief Minister. Is there a discernible growth in the number of independents in your Assembly these days, or is it much the same as it was?
Well, certainly the crossbench is largely the same size, but its composition did change at the last election, where the Greens political party saw their representation reduce from 6 to 4. But those 2 seats that the Greens no longer hold were won by independents. The major parties largely stayed the same. That did break a pattern of about 4 elections where there were only 3 parties in Parliament, Labor, Liberal and Green. There had been independents, and quite a number of them in the early days and through the first few terms of the Legislative Assembly. We now see independents elected again. So that has changed the operation of the Parliament somewhat, and given more diversity on the crossbench. But it's interesting that in this instance, in our 2024 election, the shift was amongst the composition of the crossbench, not the representation of the major parties.
Many of us on the outside looking in on the way politics is working these days, probably starting with the so-called Teals at the 2 elections ago in the federal sphere are wondering just how much more the primary vote of the major parties will decline and what the increased influence might be of the independents of smaller parties. I mean, what's your experience in governing as you've had to with a sort of the confidence and supply agreement?
Well, it's not without its challenges, but equally, it is the usual. There's been one majority government in the history of the ACT Legislative Assembly, so it is highly unlikely that will happen again in the foreseeable future. Just for the very point you've raised around major party primary votes being somewhat lower. We have experienced that here. Then at various points, the Labor Party primary vote in some electorates had exceeded 50%, and has in the history of self-government of the territory dropped below 25% in some elections in the 1990s, and was less than 20% in the very first election in 1989. So, I mean, politics does work in cycles. I think the combined major party vote has probably dropped from about 80% to more like 70% over the last 20 years. It is very candidate driven, though. Our electoral system means that parties put up a slate of candidates, not just one, in any given electorate. So our voters have not only a choice of parties or independents, but they can choose within parties on candidates as well. So it then becomes incumbent on the major parties to put forward a slate of candidates that is diverse and representative and reflects the community in which they're seeking to be elected. And so that is a very different system here and in Tasmania that differs from single member electorates, where the party just puts forward one candidate. And there tends to be a history in Hare Clark systems of where the level of party representation will stay the same, but the voters will vote out members they don't like or who are perceived to be underperforming or controversial, or on the flip side, sometimes someone so compelling will come along and run and tip out incumbent members, not necessarily because the incumbent members weren't any good. Look, I'm not a very detailed follower of the Tasmanian system, but the most recent election, it was interesting to see Bridget Archer, who had just lost the federal seat of Bass narrowly, but was seen as I think an effective local member and across the floor, topped the poll as a Liberal candidate at a state level, tipping out one of her colleagues who may or may not have been a good local member, but you can see there is an element of star power or name recognition that is a real feature of Hare Clark election.
Well, I should provide some sort of footnote to that observation of yours. Might have been because Bridget Archer also sat like you're doing for a podcast on this series.
Well,
it might have been.
May that be a portent of electoral success?
But it is interesting what you're telling me when it comes to these democratic models, the electoral systems themselves. What you're saying is, as people keep telling, I think, the established parties, the punters, the voters are not silly about this. They understand that democracy ought to be government by the people for the people. And they're able to do what you've described. They can look down the list. They can be encouraging. They can say, you don't like all those ones, well, you like that one. Or in Tasmania, they pick Bridget Archer over and above.
Yes.
So
one of the features of the Hare Clark system, when the votes are counted, particularly if a candidate does go over the quota for one seat, they have preferences that are distributed. and you get to see, exactly where the people who voted number one for you then sent their second and subsequent preferences. And what we see, and I think it was also the case in the Tasmanian election, was about nearly 10% of people who voted number one for me then went on to vote for candidates outside of the Labor Party ticket. So there sort of gives a factual basis into what one might describe as the personal vote an MP might attract or not attract, as the case may be. But equally, it does give, for example, a Labor Party voter who may not like me, they have four other choices in my electorate, and so they have to vote for me. And so you must face up to that to that reality as well. But if I was to make a general observation, you don't go into politics if you want everyone to be friends with you and everyone to like you. That is definitely not the profession to pursue if you want universal acclaim.
Well, the idea, as we've been intimating, I think that there are rusted on voters these days is a rapidly diminishing one. In a recent podcast in this series, I spoke with the South Australian Premier, Peter Malinauskas, who not only subscribed but advanced the proposition that no party, no body can assume there's anything such as a safe seat anymore. And I think what you're saying rather indicates that. So this must surely throw out a challenge in making democracy work for all the parties as well as the smaller ones to think about how they pre-select candidates.
Absolutely. And that is, I think is increasingly challenging given, to be frank, the membership base of all of the parties is narrower than its broader electoral support, and tends to be more ideologically driven, if you like, than so the average Liberal Party member is much more conservative than the average Liberal Party voter. And on the Labor Party side, the average Labor Party member is probably more progressive than the average Labor Party voter. So those challenges are there. Considerably more in single member electorate systems, I think it can.
Andrew, in the last number of years, going back 30 or 40, we can probably start with the Royal Commission in Queensland into the way the Bjelke-Petersen government operated all those years ago. I was one of the council assisting the WA Royal Commission back in the early 1990s for a couple of years, and that's where my insights came from and were influenced by. You've come along, in a sense, to a post-Royal Commission period of government where transparency, accountability, all of those phrases we're now familiar with are just taken, in a sense, for granted. Comes to the to modern government that we've got administrative appeals tribunals or the equivalent in each of the jurisdictions, I think, including in the ACT. We've got anti-corruption commissions in a number of places, started out in New South Wales. Western Australia has one. Everyone, and you in the ACT have one as well. We've got all sorts of structures in place to make sure that our parliaments and our accountability agencies work. What's the current assessment from your point of view about how those agencies, those things that have been added, if you like, to the way our democracy works, are working in the ACT?
Look, mostly pretty well. Certainly within the political system, there's probably more work to do around procurement and a range of decisions taken by the public service at arm's length from ministers and politicians. So there has the instances that have largely been the subject of interest to our Integrity Commission have been ones that have been outside of political decision making by ministers or politicians, and a little bit more in the space of procurement. I would say now there's always going to be some tweaks required, but our Integrity Commission has been in place for a number of years now. There's been a 5-year review. There's some minor changes that have been recommended that I think will receive broad support in the Territory Parliament. There's some interesting interfaces, particularly here in Canberra, with the National Integrity Commission and perhaps the intersection between Commonwealth and Territory matters in a city like Canberra. The biggest gap really is around lobbying. And interestingly, in minority parliaments now, the scrutiny and accountability gap is on non-executive members. Ministers' diaries published. There is a huge amount of accountability around cabinet decisions, FOI and parliamentary orders for documents and the like. But when a law can be passed or things can be changed without the government's support, as is the case with minority governments, there's much greater temptation to press on open doors when it comes to lobbying and to do things in ways that don't attract a level of public scrutiny. So what we have funded in our Territory budget this year is our Integrity Commission, which has an educative role as well to undertake some work on lobbying. I've been pushing against some resistance, I would note, from crossbench and opposition members in our parliament for their diaries to be published and for there to be records of who has lobbying passes into our building. And our speaker is a member of the opposition, so the control of access to this building is not in the government's hands. And so I'm forced to place questions on notice to find out who has passes to access the building and who is lobbying who. And so it's an interesting twist on this question, and it's one that will play out in our parliament in the coming weeks, months and years, presumably. I have noted at a federal level, some shadow ministers have decided to voluntarily publish who seeks meetings with them in their shadow ministerial capacities. I accept that there's a legitimate question for MPs in relation to some of their constituency and parliamentary duties. So, publishing of diaries is not about which constituents have met with them, but ministers don't publish constituent meetings. But when a particular industry association or lobby group who's required to be registered and who is seeking to influence government procurement or legislative outcomes, their meeting with a crossbencher or a shadow minister is as important as a meeting with a minister in legislative outcomes. And so that's the big gap at the moment in Australian parliamentary systems, is accountability for non-executive members.
We at the Centre for Public Integrity, Andrew, agree with what you just said wholeheartedly. It's a lack of appreciation about the importance of revealing the dealings you're having with people who want to lobby you on important matters. We're not talking about a constituent coming in to talk about their neighbourhood fence dispute or the like, but it's those industry factors, for example, that you've mentioned. That
it's a remarkable thing since we instituted changes to our electoral system as well around expenditure caps and donation caps and banned donations from particular sectors of the economy that were really donating to see benefit and outcomes. The level of lobbying has dropped back as a result of those institutional changes. So, I used to have, particularly when I was planning minister, a steady flow of developers seeking to influence planning outcomes. A couple of institutional factors in the ACT with our local government responsibilities, whereby we have development assessment on individual applications is undertaken by an independent statutory body. So unlike some councils where in New South Wales in particular, where there's been some pretty famous corruption cases of councillors being bribed to vote in favour of particular development applications, removing that from the political system and having the parliament set the overarching planning laws, but making individual development assessment on a statutory independent role with appeal mechanisms to a civil and administrative tribunal and to the Supreme Court has dramatically changed and significantly reduced the risk associated with developer lobbying of individual MPs. So if I was to recommend anything to local government, it is that the more arm's length individual development assessment is from elected representatives, the reduced risk of corruption. You still, of course, need appropriate oversight of your independent statutory decision makers as well, because the corruption risk moves to them. But with appropriate oversight bodies, appropriate appeal mechanisms, then I think you can get a much better outcome and reduce the risk considerably.
Your comments about political financing, money in politics, are interesting. Just tell our listeners where the areas are where you've banned donations.
Yeah, so property developers and from a range of other, shall I say, highly regulated industry sectors, things like gaming and the like that become quite, well, yes, obviously their sort of entire economy is, is to a certain extent regulated by government. And so reducing that or putting caps on that. And it's not just the donation side, it's the expenditure side.
Explain how that works in the ACT.
Well, you significantly reduce the risk of undue donation. They're not needed in the first place. And so our system works where there is an allocation per candidate. That's in the order of about $45,000 for a party candidate and a little more for a non-party candidate. Capped. And so an election campaign, 25 members, about $45,000 each allowed means that the maximum that can be spent by a political party on a campaign in the ACT is a little over $1 million. And so what that does is reduce the need for excessive fundraising and donations. We also have a public funding component as well. And so those two combined have really taken big money out of our political system and ensured that high wealth individuals can't buy seats in Parliament either for themselves or someone else. In the end, what wins in the ACT now is good candidates who have a great deal of grassroots support. Your currency, if you like, in your campaign is increasingly your volunteer base and your own reputation as a representative, rather than how much money you can spend on advertising.
Theoretically, if you don't have a caps rule in place, but you're an expenditure rule, I suppose, is there any danger that a well-funded organisation could effectively just fund the campaign of an individual candidate?
Yeah, that is exactly right. So, and look, and we have seen that, and I'll be a little controversial here, in that they're not necessarily, I don't want to cast aspersions any of these being owned by any particular donor, but the success of the teal movement and some of the biggest spending campaigns in Australian political history have been in certain hotly contested House of Representatives seats and the odd Senate contest, where campaigns went from being in the tens of thousands of dollars to being in the hundreds of thousands and sometimes into the millions. Now, I think the federal system is changing now, has been changed to address that, but it's not always the case that the money behind a candidate is not ethically sourced, but it's still
There's a lot of
money speaks in politics, and so I think expenditure caps are important as a way of levelling the playing field a little, because even the nicest, most loved candidate, if they're backed by millions and millions of dollars, has a great comparative advantage over potentially an equally nice and lovable candidate.
So, do you think the ACT Parliament's likely to promote amendments to its political financing laws in regard or any other respects?
Oh, look, I think they're probably after each election there is a regular scheduled review. There will undoubtedly be questions raised about, particularly about technological change, I would say. So the big issue that's emerging is AI and deepfake material. And so I think, I can't be 100% sure on this, but at least according to the media reports at the time, last year's territory election saw the first use by a major political party of an AI-generated advertising campaign, and it was the Liberal Party using a deep fake of me in some ads. So
Was it complimentary? I'm assuming it was.
Oh, well, I don't think it was. I mean, to some degree, I probably had more hair and better teeth. But it's an interesting step now that AI-generated activity is being used. On one level, it's probably not that different from using the grainy black and white photo, when you're not looking your best. Like that's also common as well. It has been for a while, but this is taking that to the next level, I think. And so there's a legitimate discussion to be had about regulation in that space, as much as it might be that, although it was quite clear the ad was an attack ad on me by the Liberal Party, it's not too big a leap for deepfake AI to be used in a less transparent way.
Well, the South Australian Premier, who I mentioned, Mr. Malinowskis, that shares that concern. He was quite strong about some of the deep fake things he'd seen and general level. But if you undermine using AI, the legitimacy of the political processes, it would, of course, be counterproductive to our democracies. Andrew, going back to the comment about having been on the National Cabinet through those difficult COVID years and talking about lobbying, talking about deepfake and no doubt a range of other issues, is there scope for national standards which would apply, for example, in relation to lobbying, or do we leave it to 100 flowers, let's see which one's bloom sort of thing?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, which is I guess a common theme of our federation. In that it's both the strength and a weakness at times. The strength of it is that there is room within the federation for one or more jurisdictions to be leaders in this area and to potentially trial or pilot particular ideas and approaches. Many times they'll succeed, other times they won't, and then other jurisdictions can learn from those successes or failures. On the other hand, they're depending on the sort of the risk taking willingness or the nature of a particular state or territory's political system, it can mean sometimes there can be decades between the first state or territory doing something, and then by the time the last one catches up, can be a very long time. And my case study there would be gay lesbian law reform, for example, that some jurisdictions had really equalised their statute books 20 years ago, and there are others still got a long way to go.
Is this concept of providing as much outside help to our parliaments and to all of the people who work in governance, and the Latimer House principles are interesting in relation to all of this, and I think they've been brought to bear to see, in a sense, how the ACT part goes. And is there a review on it at the moment? What do you expect out of all of that?
Look, I think we've had them in place for some time, and those principles have been pretty strongly adhered to in those regards. For example, scrutiny of budgets, public accounts committees being chaired by opposition members, and there being a range of effectively a statutory independence given to a range of officials, from electoral commissioners to the Parliament itself, to integrity commissioners, the Auditor General. Like there's a number of entities, and so we now have two appropriation bills, one for the general government sector and another that is the Office of the Legislative Assembly, which has those entities funded under that stream. And so there's a very accountable process there around their budget submissions. The Speaker and the relevant statutory office holders, they will attend the Budget Expenditure Review Committee process and put their case. If the government, for whatever reason, disagrees with the recommendation, we have to publish our reasons why. There are times when we have, and sometimes the reason has been as simple as we don't have the available resources to fully meet the entity's requests. So, I think there's important checks and balances there. Sometimes in a small parliament, it can be difficult to meet every single sort of stated objective of Latimer House principles to its fullest, because you run out of members to be able to do that. But I think we do our best and do it quite well.
Way of outlining, and they certainly, again, for these integrities here, point to important, albeit subtle points. I mean, having that separate appropriation for the assembly and those entities you mentioned, including I think the Integrity Commission, quite important. They can't be starved of funds, you would like to think. Before we finish, Andrew, how did you get it? How did you get into politics? And when you did, were you thinking taking part in a democratic process, or were you, to put it bluntly, were you on a political mission to change the world in a particular way?
I wouldn't go that far. So I'm born in Lismore in northern New South Wales in the early to mid 1970s. So I've blocked over the half century now. But we moved to Canberra when my father got a graduate position in the Commonwealth Treasury. So in 1977. So I was only 4 years old. And so my parents were very young. They were teenagers when I was born. So they were finishing, both got through university with a toddler. So probably statistically speaking, if you were born to teenage parents in northern New South Wales in the 1970s, your career pathway probably wouldn't by default be into representative politics and to have a career like I've had. But I think moving to Canberra was obviously very pivotal. So my childhood was spent, I guess, growing up around a gaggle of young Treasury economists. So So we used to go camping with at Jarvis Bay with Ken Henry, and that's a long time ago. He may not remember the young Andrew Barr from way back then, but certainly my parents are delighted in telling me that story over the years. And so, look, I think I first got a real interest post the election of the Hawke government. So probably by 1985, 86, I would have been, 12, 13 by then. Going into high school, you sort of started to become a little bit more politically aware in those days. My dad was, had been 6 or 7 years in Treasury. Paul Keating had been Cabinet Treasurer. So there was a lot of dinner time conversation about all of those economic reforms and that, that era in Australian politics. Bob Hawke was a larger than life figure. So the first election I really remember was his win in 1983 when I was 10 years of age. So I was interested in politics, but not had given no real thought to being involved. And then one very cold Canberra winter's day, I was sent home from an extracurricular activity at Lyman High, the public high school in my area, because I wasn't wearing the school uniform. And this, I was wearing a woolen jumper because it was cold. It wasn't a school jumper, if you like. This was actually in breach of the ACT's Education Act. You could not deny a student access to education in the public system because of not wearing the school uniform. And so this sparked a degree of outrage and political activism in me. And I ran for the school board and for school captain and was elected to both. And so at age 15, I would say that was an early lesson in, if you want to change the world, you need to sort of be actively involved in the decision-making process.
All inspired by that outrageously unjust decision of Lynham High School.
Indeed. And so that probably started it. But then the decision to join the Labor Party came in my first year at university at ANU in early 1992, just after Paul Keating had become Prime Minister. That which I think occurred from memory in December of 1991. So I then got involved in student labour at the ANU and joined Young Labour and Australian Young Labour, which is where I first met Tony Burke and Ed Shuzik, and a number of the people who are now very senior ministers in the Australian government. And so, yes, so we started that. I'd say that was probably the moment that set me on the course to where I am now.
Where do you think, in your case at least, if not others, this appreciation of how our liberal democracy works or is intended to work comes from? Is it something you learned along the way? Did you do a civics course? Did they run programs when you first got elected?
Well, look, I was, it was, I think, a greater part of the curriculum back in the 80s. Like I think the research is showing now that teenagers in that era knew a little bit more about politics and democracy and governance than they do now, which is an interesting trend over the last 3 or 4 decades. And look, I studied economics and business were most of my areas of focus in year 11 and 12. And then I studied, my major was political science, Australian politics at ANU, and I also studied Australian economic history and a straight line in economics as well, together with philosophy and sociology. So I don't know that I am your second average. In that this was my, I spent 4 years at ANU deeply engaged in all of these issues. So that probably sets me apart a little from many. So I was always interested in it and made it, both an academic pursuit and a professional one.
Andrew, this has been a really interesting discussion. Thank you for generously joining me today to talk about the issues we've covered. You've certainly been, from my point of view, very open and transparent about the issues, what needs to be done and what's happening. It's been very informative. So thank you for joining the podcast series today.
My pleasure, Michael. Thank you very much.